Let me see. First, we just wanted to share some opening remarks to talk about recent kind of schedule changes in today's move to in-person. It sounds like we did have some guests planning to attend in person, and we're very, very sorry to miss the opportunity to connect with them in person. But as we are short a voting member, our ability to have quorum requires us to either be all virtual or have a physical quorum, and that wasn't going to be possible tonight. So since we had to move this discussion from our last scheduled meeting to this week, we wanted to make sure we could move forward. We have a little bit of a backlog that we're trying to make sure we can clear out by the end of April. So we're going to have a couple of additionally scheduled meetings. We'll have 2 meetings in March to make up for the missed meeting in February, and 2 meetings in April to get through the current cases that we have. So we're very, very grateful for all of the folks who've been kind of participating, joining the discussion, and very apologetic that the logistics can sometimes be frustrating. We are working as a team with kind of all different elements to make sure we've got protocols and communication in place to make that a little bit more reliable. But please feel free to contact me or Mummy and Ian as we kind of navigate that challenge, and let us know if there are things we can do to make it easier. We are very delighted to have folks attend these meetings with us. So with that, I will, Anika, is she on? She sometimes joins by phone and we don't have her unmuted. I'm going to check the phone participants. Anika, if you're on the phone, would you let us know? Okay. I just wanted to give her one more minute to join. Okay, we'll go ahead with attendance, and Ian or Mummy, or anyone, if Anika joins, please just let me know. I'm hoping that we'll get her before we end up in the investigation review. So I'll call attendance. Commissioner Montgomery is absent for now. Commissioner McCullough. Commissioner Smith.
I'm here.
Thank you. Commissioner Ortiz.
Here. I'm actually here.
Oh, excellent. Perfect. Wonderful. I hope that was you. Thank you. Sorry about that. Commissioner Dean.
Here.
Commissioner Evans here. Commissioner Miller.
Here.
Excellent. So we've got everyone. We've got a quorum. We're excited and ready to get started. Okay. So the first thing we want to cover is vice chair elections. The chair selection is done by the county board, and the vice chair is selected by the by the community oversight board. So at our next meeting, we're planning to hold a vote to elect a vice chair. And so we wanted to give folks time to think about that opportunity and prepare any remarks, that we can have at the beginning of the next meeting. And then we'll hold a vote to figure out what the best path forward is for next year. It would be helpful to me, Mummy and Ian, to kind of know who's interested in doing that in advance, so we can make the agenda kind of timing make sense and coordinate associated logistics. And then we will plan to go over another case investigation or investigation review. So any questions on vice chair elections for next week or next week? Yeah. Wonderful. Okay, with that, we will move to approve the previous meeting minutes. Ian, are you able to pull those up on the screen?
Yes, just give me 1 second.
Yeah, no rush. And if anyone already knows of any issues that we need to identify, feel free to chime in now. Hi, Mommy. Okay. Okay, so January meeting, I had corrected something from an internal circulation, but I think that we already addressed that. It looks like it was. Did anyone else have thoughts or comments on the last meeting minutes? Okay, would anyone like to, I'm happy to hear a motion to approve the January meeting minutes.
I make a motion to approve the January meeting minutes.
Charles.
Wonderful. Excellent. All in favor? Aye.
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 All opposed? Nay. Any abstentions? Anika, since you're on the phone, I just want to make sure we capture your vote correctly.
I switched to the computer. Aye.
Aye, okay, excellent. Okay, perfect. So we can approve the previous meeting minutes and move on to the investigation review. Let me just have that in front of us. So again, our kind of process right now is we'll have the two investigation leads, in this case, myself and David Smith, to go over the summary and the kind of relevant policy issues, and then we'll hear from the IPA and OPR on additional context they may want to add. We'll have open discussion and then vote on our recommendations. The investigation we're reviewing tonight stems from kind of a mistaken identity situation resulting in a community member who filed a complaint against an officer alleging that he was tackled in a grocery store parking lot while the officer was holding a gun. We're going to discuss whether ACPD's policies relating to use of force and bias-free policing were violated. So we'll kind of walk through the summary. Dave and I will give you our, what we saw from the review of the evidence and relevant considerations for both use of force and bias-free policing. In this instance, the complainant was a grocery kind of delivery driver who had been picking up orders from a local grocery store where, because his phone was dying, he was running back and forth to his vehicle to charge his phone and be able to pay for the orders he was picking up. In that same time period, the grocery store manager called in a complaint to Arlington County Police Department, alleging that a Black man with short dreadlocks in a gray tank top and blue pants had stolen energy drinks and that the store wanted to press charges. So the first officer who arrived onto the scene parked at a distance from the entrance and was monitoring the scene using binoculars, and was able to identify that the complainant matched the description provided by the store manager and observed the complainant going in and out of the store running towards his vehicle. So the police officer who responded first gets out of his vehicle and runs toward the complainant, issuing verbal commands to stop, drawing his gun from his holster and pointing it at the complainant. The complainant at this point is visible on the body-worn camera footage running away from the store towards the vehicle, but does immediately stop and throw his hands in the air when he's issued the command, "Please stop." At that point, he's not visible from the waist down because he's behind the trunk of his vehicle. So the officer approaches the complainant with the gun drawn and pointed at the complainant, who is kind of palpably confused and scared. And as the officer approaches, he lowers his weapon and, creates a physical restraint on the complainant to put him in handcuffs, explain that he's being detained. The initial verbal exchange is certainly, reflective of somebody who doesn't know why they're being detained. And then the interaction that follows gets a little bit more into the details of why the police are responding and what the what the complainant was doing in the garage, running back and forth. So Dave, I want to open up to you if you want to add any context to that, or have initial comments on the use of force and bias-free policing, and then we can point to some of the policy text that we want to discuss specifically before we give the IPA and OPR a chance to weigh in.
Okay, yeah, no, I think, Julie, that's a fair summary of the facts. And so I will go over the policy and the factors. You know, I ideally we would have an in-person meeting. I know that wasn't possible, but I think this will be a valuable discussion, and I'm really glad that we're able to have this discussion, because I think it, although this was an incident where no physical injuries were sustained, I think it represents sort of a good scenario to talk about the underlying issue on use of force. So I want to direct our attention first to the police use of force policy, and in particular, section E3 that talks about display of firearms. And in particular, I want to reference the last paragraph that policy on use of force with regard to display of firearms, because that's where I think we have the primary difference with ACPD. So it says, I'll just read the policy, which says the mere display of a firearm, including the pointing of that firearm at a suspect without a subsequent discharge, does not constitute deadly force. However, the pointing of a firearm at any person is a serious act, and officers shall not do so unless they can tactically justify their action. Whenever a firearm is pointed at a person or persons, the circumstances shall be documented in a case report or field investigation. So that's the policy that we're looking at. And our view of that policy is that we read that policy to mean that there must be some level of objectively reasonable justification for an ACPD officer to pull and point a firearm at a civilian, and that in the absence of such a justification, in the absence of those facts or a justification, that could result in a violation of the use of force, a violation of the use of force policy. So as you know, ACPD is aware, and as Mummy's report made reference to, this standard is sort of governed in large measure by two things. One, an earlier Supreme Court case, Graham versus Connor, and the specific factors that point to what factors should you look at. That it's not all inclusive, but that in the police policy, what are the factors to look at to determine whether there was an objectively reasonable use of force? So the Graham versus Connor objectively reasonable standard talks about objectively reasonable police officer from the perspective of a reasonable police officer on the scene. And it encourages folks not to do Monday morning quarterbacking or 2020 hindsight. So that's the approach that we take in this, is like a reasonable police officer on the scene, and trying to do our best not to simply do a Monday morning quarterback situation. So in terms of the criteria for what is an objectively reasonable use of force, there are 5 things that the ACPD policy lists: the severity of the crime, the immediate threat posed by a suspect to the officer, the level of resistance, the potential danger to the community posed by the suspect, and the circumstances of a rapidly evolving situation or the dynamics of the situation. So just kind of going through that, the first criteria is the severity of the crime. And that's a significant factor in this matter, because, and in many ways, it's not the only factor, but it strongly colors how I view it, which is we're talking about a minor larceny, the theft of energy drinks. And later it sort of came out that maybe it was just powder for energy drinks. But at the time, the officer had a good faith belief that the person he saw on the scene matched the description, which the person did. The description was almost a perfect match, and he had a reasonable good faith belief that that person had stolen energy drinks from a Safeway, like less than $10. There's no dollar figure, but energy drinks more than one, maybe two. An energy drink is like $2.50 or something, whatever. Very low level larceny. And so that was the facts presented. And again, the officer had every reason to think that the person he saw had done that. Obviously, it was a case of mistaken identity, but we're taking it from his perspective at that time. There is no indication of well, get to this later. But so that fact alone, the fact that it's like $10 or less, a minor larceny, cuts against his pulling the weapon, in my view. Pretty strongly cuts against it. So second factor is, what is the immediate threat posed by the suspect to the officer? And, looking at the body worn camera, there's not a lot of threat posed to the officer. And the officer in his interview said the reason that he pulled the weapon was he lost sight of the suspect, the complainant, behind a pillar, and that he ran up behind the car and couldn't see his full body, could only see his from his shoulders up, and that he didn't know who was in the car, and the car had tinted windows. Given that, given that, again, there's no indication in the lookout that there was any report of a weapon. Again, it cuts against the officer pulling the weapon, in our view. The threat posed by the suspect arguably is, in the officer's articulation of his perception, the fact that the car, he didn't know who else was in the car, was another factor that he felt justified the threat. But I think reasonably objectively speaking, what you have is somebody who appears to be running away from the store, arguably to leave the scene because he may have stolen something. That still is, fleeing from the scene of a minor larceny, just objectively, reasonably, in my mind, and this is where we'll have the discussion, doesn't justify a threat to the officer such that the officer should pull out lethal force. Third is level of resistance.
David, can I add one piece to that?
Yeah.
I think for the second criteria here, for the immediate threat, there are a number of factors kind of at play in the scenario, kind of, being in the garage, the suspect matching the description, all these things. And one point that was raised to us by OPR was, the test for Graham versus Connor is, could another officer with the same level of training and experience reasonably have made the same judgment? And as we look at, the immediate threat posed by the suspect to officers, I think that everything that you pointed out about the kind of minor nature and the visibility of the suspect and his compliance. The other thing that I want to add is the distinction between pulling your weapon and pointing your weapon at somebody, where, maintaining a tactical advantage in a situation that has lots of variables, where you're prepared to respond to a threat, is, there is a distinction here between drawing and having your weapon ready versus pointing it at someone. And that in the report about him being not visible behind a pole was after the suspect had visibly, or after the complainant, who the officer believed to be the suspect, had put his hands visibly in the air, and that was visible through that period of time. So I just wanted to add those two things, the kind of the distinction, and that and maybe this gets into 3 is what you were going to say about the level of resistance. So sorry, I did just want to highlight the distinction we're talking about between drawing your weapon and pointing your weapon at someone.
Yeah, that's a good point. So, and actually the last thing I'll add to the criteria of threat to the officer, which also goes to the fourth criteria, which is threat to others, is the nature of where this took place. So I know that from discussions with the police that there are a number of thefts from that Safeway. And I know that throughout the county, there are, there are certainly armed robberies that occur, but I just don't think that those sort of diverse and diffuse other factors, the fact that people have stolen things from that Safeway before, and the fact that elsewhere in the county there have been armed robberies, leads to the conclusion that in this particular case, with this situation, that those environmental factors justified drawing and pointing a weapon at this person. So the third factor is level of resistance, 0. I mean, there's this, and at the point at which the officer, now I'm focusing on the officer pulling his weapon. The first thing you see, and the first thing I think the officer was aware of, is the complainant suspect running from the store to the car. And looking carefully at the camera footage, it's absolutely clear that he puts his hands up immediately within 2 seconds upon the officer reasonably yelling, "Stop, police." Puts his hands up in the air, he shrieks, he's clearly scared. So there's no resistance at the point at which the officer pulls his weapon. Now, sort of the second half of the use of force is after the officer holsters his weapon and detains the person. There's a little interaction there. The complainant is, as described as seen on the video and as described by the officer, starts to kneel down. Officer holsters his weapon. Complainant has some conversation saying, "All right, bro, what did I do?" And as the officer approaches to put his hand on him, the complainant does stand up. And I think there's a misunderstanding there. And in my view, what the officer does to detain and restrain the person, the complainant, and put him in handcuffs is within my view of what's reasonable. So I'm focusing on the pulling and pointing of the weapon. But with regard to that in particular, there's no resistance, and that's a 0 factor. The fourth factor is potential danger to the community. I don't see anything there, and at all. And there were 1 or 2 other cars in the parking lot. It's hard to tell, but there were potentially other civilians in the parking lot. If anything, I think that might cut against the officer pulling his weapon for their safety, but I don't think there's factors on that in this criteria, potential danger to the community posed by the suspect, that justify the officer pulling his weapon. And the final factor is rapidly evolving circumstances or the rapidly changing dynamics. That one, I will say, yes, there are some things like the fact that the complainant runs quickly. Okay, I mean, it looks like to me consistent with fleeing from the scene, but that is a rapidly evolving and a dynamic situation. I get that. I also get that the car had tinted windows, so the officer didn't know who was in it, and potentially there could be other people in the car. But again, absent there being any indication that the victim complainant has a weapon, or this being in a super high crime area. Now, if this were happening in a particularly high crime area in DC, maybe this would be different. And I understand that there have been thefts from that Safeway, but pulling a weapon and pointing it at someone raises the level of death to a degree that, as a community member, I don't feel comfortable with. So, and again, this is our objectively reasonable, what our view is of what's objectively reasonable. But I do want to emphasize that from my perspective, this is all done in good faith. This is not something that, we're thinking that this officer has some conscious animus, and we'll get to the bias policing in a minute, but that it just unfolded in a way that, at least for my sensibility, was not objectively reasonable. So that's all I have to say on that. If we want to discuss that, or we could go to the bias policing.
I'm just going to add one thing, and then I think we can discuss use of force before we go to bias policing, just because this is a lot to cover, and I want to make sure that we can kind of get into a focused discussion. But in the interview with the officer, the reported tactical justification was that he was alarmed that the suspect appeared to be fleeing in a fight or flight state, and did identify that it was possible that the person was trying to access a weapon in his vehicle or drive away in his vehicle. But from what's visible on the body-worn camera footage, that doesn't quite seem like what happened. So I want to acknowledge that one of the other dynamics identified was the distance between them, right? So the distance that the officer had to cover to get to the suspect to have a full visual and take control of the situation did involve going, around some obstacles and losing sight. And that once the officer approached the person and was able to kind of hear and begin this verbal exchange where his compliance was much more visible, that he did put his gun away before initiating the kind of physical restraints to detain him. So, you've got, I bet almost all of you know the number of seconds, but now I've forgotten, you've got this very quick period where, we're talking about judgment calls, and I acknowledge that, there are these variables. I think that part of what we want to be sensitive to originates from, some reading of local and national circumstances relating to kind of pointing weapons and the risks there. So I think we'll get into that, but I want to see, let's see, should we have OPR and the IPA comment and then the COB discuss this portion, and then we'll discuss bias policing next? I think that will make for a more focused discussion. Dave, do you agree?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, so I want to invite anyone from OPR to join us and add kind of comments and input on this use of force consideration. Oh, Jim, please, if you have a question.
You're muted, Jim.
No, let's
Oh,
go
there you
to OPR and then I'll
Okay.
We can go back for
Thank you.
our comment.
Good evening, everybody. I don't know if I'm on camera or not. Our camera's not working great. So
We can see you.
Okay. I just wanted to start with a general comment that, we take every circumstance where a member of this agency has to use force very seriously. In fact, even without a complaint from community members, our supervisors investigate every circumstance where our officers have to use force to ensure that the force used is within the law and within our policy. In this particular case, myself and several others within the police department have reviewed the facts of this incident and found that the officer's actions were within the law and our policy. The IPA's report and David just outlined the totality of the circumstance test from Graham, but there's a few particular points that I think are relevant for consideration. This incident occurred about 10:45 at night. At the time of the encounter, the officer was by himself. The officer saw the person engaged in a verbal altercation with a store employee, followed by the person sprinting from the store towards what was reported to be the subject's vehicle, which was also running at the time. And while this was an initial call for a larceny, I think it's important to consider that it's not uncommon for officers to arrive on scene and find that the crime committed is actually different from what's originally. We actually looked at all the robbery incidents from the month of December. And in that month, there were 30 robbery incidents, and 12 of those, 40%, were incidents that started as a shoplifting and escalated into a robbery. So in totality, we believe the circumstances encountered could certainly lead somebody, particularly a trained police officer, to believe that this may have been something more significant than a larceny of an energy. David talked a bit about Graham versus Connor and the reasonableness in not using the 2020 vision of hindsight. The other part that I would just highlight is that in that case, the court said that the calculus of reasonableness must embody allowance for the fact that police officers are often forced to make split-second judgments in circumstances that are tense, uncertain, and rapidly evolving about the amount of force that is necessary in any particular situation. I just felt it was important to highlight that point. And the last thing I'll add, and I'll ask Albert and Tosh if they want to add anything, is we also reviewed the entire case with our county attorney, who agrees with our assessment that it was lawful and within our policy. Is there anything you wanted to add?
I would say looking at those 12 incidents specifically from December that transpired from a larceny to a robbery, 1 was with a firearm, 3 were with a threat or use of a knife, 4 were with force, and the other 4 were with a threat of using force. So some of those things are actually visible. Some of those things actually have an actual object, but to move into a robbery scenario does not always mean that you will see the actual object as well.
And then I just want to highlight one incident that occurred on March 4th at this particular location in the middle of the day. The facts of the case are that an individual walked into the Safeway, attempted to steal a Hershey bar, put it in their breast pocket, and then upon attempting to exit the Safeway, violently assaulted the clerk, punched him in the eye, contact came out, and then threatened to stab him, and then fled the scene. So this fact pattern of a minor, I guess, larceny, if you will, matches almost identically to what occurred that night. This was for a Hershey bar that turned into a violent robbery, and that individual escaped the scene and then threatened to stab someone.
I think we all really appreciate the additional context and data. I know we've talked a lot about, kind of bringing in kind of the data so that we can be tracking what kinds of things come up and recur in different scenarios. And also, I want to say it was not my understanding that a use of force review was done before the complaint came in. So if that was not the case, that's my misunderstanding, but I thought that's what we talked about in the debrief. I think that context is really helpful, and I want to invite comment from the COB. So I want to raise a kind of parallel analogy that colored Dave's and my thinking in this, which was that the recent officer-involved shooting in Fairfax by Tyson's, where a man was fleeing on foot after stealing sunglasses from the Nordstrom, that he was shot by an officer who it was revealed had pulled his weapon recently in other kind of situations that, with the benefit of hindsight, seemed like they may not have been as tactically justified. And so part of what we're trying to get to here is definitely not, fixating on a single situation and making a hard line here, but identifying opportunities where we are seeing the windows that we have to be proactive in implementing policy changes or data monitoring or additional training that can reduce the likelihood that an officer is involved in a fatal mistake, where the difference between having your weapon out and pointing it at somebody is so much closer to a fatal mistake. And so in this discussion, a lot of what we have reviewed and considered is that, while the kind of palpable fear and the very audible alarm and confusion from the person who did immediately comply, it is very emotional to watch, and it is very kind of, moving to understand the community member's perspective. We also want to represent the ACPD officer's perspective that, our policy and use and kind of adherence to those things and evolution of them over time can be what help reinforce the difference between a fatal mistake and a mistaken identity being, readily cleared. So I think it is very relevant to understand that in this time period, late at night in this area, there are, sounds like almost 10 of those, larcenies turned robberies involved weapons or threats. I think that's helpful. I do think we want to balance, understanding the perspective of the threat in that scenario versus the threat of a fatal mistake, which is what I think motivated Dave and I to look so closely at this specific distinction between pulling your weapon and pointing your weapon. So I want to give Mummy a chance to provide input to this point, and then we'll open it up for a little bit more discussion amongst the COB.
Thank y'all. Sorry for the background noise. My daughter is here at the table with me. I think there's a lot to unpack in this investigation. I'm going to start with talking about it a little bit specifically and then go a little bit more macro. So on the use of force allegation, as was mentioned earlier, I sustained the allegation. I felt that, upon looking at the evidence, listening to the interviews, watching the body-worn camera footage, I also reviewed the CAD report to see kind of what the initial call for service was. I reviewed all of the officers who responded to the scene. There were 3 officers in total that responded to the scene. But I specifically narrowed in on that time period where the officer who's the subject of this complaint engaged with the complainant in the time period from when he pulled into the parking garage, observed him for a few minutes, and then chose to get out of the vehicle and apprehend him, and specifically the period at which he chose to pull out his firearm and point it at the complainant. There were definitely periods of times where things were moving rapidly. The officer, when they got to the scene, they used their binoculars and observed the complainant for a minute or so to see, or at least a minute, I would say, just based on when the body-worn camera comes on, to see and assess kind of what the situation was. I think that is something that allows an officer in a very safe way to kind of assess the threat level and all of the factors that we talked about. There were structures in the parking garage, obviously because it's a parking garage, that the complainant is running in between the store and to the vehicle, and so for a brief second, and I think second is even like probably on the longer side, running in between the car and in between the columns, his view is obstructed for a second. But from my perspective, when the officer first gave commands and said to stop, you see the complainant immediately raise his hands, look directly at the officer, and he's like this. And so that to me is indicative of someone who's complying, who's stopped, and just the minute at which he had stopped, or the place where he had stopped, was behind a vehicle. And I think that's important as well to, in being objective and looking at the circumstances. I just want to kind of paint a visual here. The officer could only see the complainant from basically the shoulders up. So most importantly, what I focused on was the hand. And I think that the key difference here is what we're focusing on in terms of visibility, because I think that was one of the key things that impacted the officer's judgment in whether or not to pull out his firearm, was the visibility. So he's standing behind the vehicle. What I would have liked to see happen in that moment is the complainant has his hands in the air. The officer maybe has his hand on his weapon just in case he needs to use it. And because the complainant is stopped with his hands up, move away from the vehicle, step in front of the car so I can see you, before running towards him and pointing a firearm at him. Because it seems to me, if I'm just looking at it from a logical perspective, if you think that the situation is life-threatening enough for you to pull out a firearm, that you should be, instead of running towards it, trying to control the situation and make it more safe for you as well as people around you. Because I think, Dave, you raised a good point earlier that if he had pulled, because he pulled the firearm, and if he had pulled the trigger, just 1 second, baby, he could have killed or injured the complainant or other people who were in the parking garage structures. I think that's an important thing to draw out. As the officer is clearing the vehicle, which that happens in a couple of seconds coming around, I did affirmatively see the officer and hear the officer holstering his weapon. So I did not find any sort of reason to believe that the officer still had their gun in their hand when they went to actually handcuff the complainant, which was part of the allegation that the complainant made. So similar to Dave, I focused in on just the moment at which he pointed the firearm. I did not find that to be reasonable, using an objectively reasonable standard. I found it to be excessive. And I think even I'm not even so much focused on this particular officer's conduct, but I think what it's also, even though I thought it was excessive and not appropriate, I think what is also important here is when we're talking about the objectively reasonable standard, right? Even if we could make an argument that this is legal, does not make it right. And that the officer chose to escalate the situation, and I believe that was completely unnecessary. And I think if we are going to allow the standard to be that an officer can make any possible explanation, and we have to accept that as objectively reasonable, then we're not doing anything here. We have to shift the culture of policing by demanding better. And that starts with, what are the standards that we're talking about here? What is this? What does this objectively reasonable standard mean? And elevating that standard, right? And I think that comes from better training, better policies, better data, which was another huge issue for me in this complaint was, just unpacking the lack of data around these kind of interactions. That I'll get to that in a second. The other thing that I think is a problem for me is I did not hear the officer during his interview describing that he explicitly thought this was an armed robbery. Maybe that was what was going on in his head. I don't know, but he did not say that. And so I'm not willing to assume that. I also think it's a very dangerous, slippery slope to, for lack of a better word, fearmonger, and say, well, it could be this, it could be that, it could be this. What has to happen here is there has to be a balance of, okay, as police officers who frankly are probably much better equipped than the average person or any of us even, to assess, the exact threat level, or know exactly like what crimes are going on in what areas and what just happened earlier that day or earlier that week and that sort of thing. And so I'm not trying to discredit that, but what I'm saying is that cannot be a justification to treat every community member that you encounter as a dangerous criminal. Your first and foremost purpose should be to protect and serve, and that includes protecting community members. So engaging with people at the onset when the circumstances, as far as what going into it, are a $10 larceny at best. I could understand if there was an armed robbery in progress and you're going to go in, full throttle. That is different. But to think that someone running back and forth from their vehicle, to assume that that person is engaged in some sort of dangerous armed robbery, and that's not what was reported, without waiting to just see if that's what's going on, or just investigating further, or, just for that not to be the foremost thought in your mind, and figuring out what is the balance of being able to give community members some form of benefit of the doubt and assessing the situation before you go in that nature, while not compromising officer safety and safety of those around. And I think that that's especially important when you are talking about people of color who are known to disproportionately be the subjects and victims of racial profiling or excessive use of force that can escalate to deadly force. So I think, the kind of justification that it could have been this armed robbery and it could have been that armed robbery and it could have been this and that circumstance. Yes, that might be a factor that an officer should consider when assessing the totality of the circumstances, but that cannot be that cannot be the way that we go into these type of low-level offenses. Oh, good job. Unless we are okay with split-second judgments that can possibly turn into a lethal use of force, because those split-second judgments are definitely things that officers have to do in their day-to-day course of their work, and that is not something that should ever be taken lightly. And that is probably one of the hardest parts of their jobs. That is also the highest responsibility that they have in their jobs, and that split-second judgment, the point that you have unholstered, you've put your hand on your firearm is step one. You've unholstered it, that's step two. You've now drawn it and pointed it at someone, that's step three. And you have one more step left before you pull the trigger. That's an extremely serious maneuver. And that leads me to my last point on that, which is the data. We don't know the extent of, whether or not that there is any sort of problem around this, or if we need better policy or better training, because there is currently no data being collected around how many times firearms, at least to my understanding, are being pointed at individuals. Whether we want to set the standard at drawing or pointing, I think pointing is really like the big the big piece for me, but there are jurisdictions that collect data around both. I don't see why we should be any different, and I don't think that we can actually even truly justify or really call, to court what we're doing in Arlington as it pertains to pointing to firearms until we actually collect and assess data around this. But the problem I have is that pointing a firearm as it pertains to our current policy does not even warrant an automatic use of force review. So it doesn't require that a supervisor have to look at it and it go through an administrative review, which would then turn into an administrative investigation if they found it to be excessive. All that's required by policy is that the officer would have to document it in their field case report, which obviously a supervisor would sign off on. And so there is an opportunity for a supervisor who's signing off on the report if they feel that the words don't align with what they think should have happened in that situation, then they can certainly go and look at it. But I think that the best practice and what we should be doing is that should automatically trigger a review of the body worn camera footage, and that data should be collected, because that's what is, I think, going to really help to paint the picture here. The last thing I'll say just about big picture is that, I think there's a lot to unpack even around the Safeway manager and the call that they made. It seemed as though, and I don't know because the Safeway manager wasn't a part of the complaint, but it seemed from the comment that was made at the end of the video that, just one second, you want to try it? Sorry, y'all. It seemed like from the comment that was made that maybe there has been, basically, I think the officer, as they were walking away, said, just make sure that the Safeway manager is sure about people before they give a description. It seems as though there was a little bit of a phone tag where the store clerk said, there was a larceny in progress, and the store clerk seems to have to know the complainant because he comes in there and works Uber Eats often. And so it doesn't seem like the store clerk described the complainant, but the store manager is the person who made the phone call. And then I don't know how he zoomed in on the complainant, but he gave the description that matched the complainant. And it did match the complainant like identically. So it seems that there was some sort of miscommunication there. It is possible that there is, that maybe the root of the racial profiling issue is with the manager and not with the officer, in terms of like what started it, or kind of how to fully look at the picture. But I think if we're looking at what the department or what we could do as, a collaborative effort is to kind of think about the big picture here. Like, was this incident worth 3 officers reporting to the scene? Was this incident worth a escalation to this level of force? Was this situation worth just one second, a community member being severely traumatized by the events that uncounted? Just one second, baby, just one second. And I would say that it was not. I would say that, okay, one second, I will get it for you. I would say that the big picture here, so I'm gonna go off camera for a second. One second. 3-year-olds have zero patience. But I would say that, if officers are getting a call that there's a larceny in progress for energy drinks, that, we should be talking about, should they even be responding to calls like this? I understand that the Safeway manager said that they wish to prosecute. And this is, I think, part of a larger conversation just around community policing and prosecution. But I mean, maybe a better approach is that they have store security handle situations like this, unless there is unarmed store security, unless there is a threat to someone's safety or, some sort of standard being drawn. But I would much rather be sitting here talking about a complaint from the store manager that the police did not take their larceny complaint seriously than for us to be talking about someone having a firearm pointed at them unnecessarily and being traumatized from that. So that's the last thing I wanted to say about big picture. And then I think I'll reserve the comments about the bias policing stuff until we get to that discussion. I appreciate y'all giving me time to get all of that out while managing Fatima over here.
No, very, very helpful. And I do want to make sure we get to the second portion of the complaint. So before I have like 2 more things I wanted to add for Mummy. And I see Captain Kim's hand is raised, but I do just want to give a second to get Jim, Lisa, Anika, Gary, and Charles an opportunity to weigh in or ask questions or share thoughts, so we can have a little bit of discussion on this before we revisit other issues and kind of try to frame out the rest of this situation. Yeah, Gary.
I appreciate Captain Kim's additional inputs, regarding going from a Hershey bar to a robbery. That's, obviously good context. And even thinking about that, our officers are there to defend and protect our community. I think even in that, I still, and I'm not trying to Monday night quarterback thing, but I think that logic that even Captain Chamberlain said the same thing is, here's what's in our community. I still think that even in that logic, without Monday night quarterbacking, I think it gets back to that. I mean, that sounds like within the policy that I've read is ample grounds to pull out and prepare to, right? You had the concrete stanchion from watching the video and stuff. I could actually see, in that distance involved, just as far as, the evidence. But that's just a general thought. I appreciate and I acknowledge that is important about the context of what's going on. But I still think inside of that context and the written policy that ample warrant to, we used to say BPT, be prepared to get in position. I mean, because we might have to get in action here. And so that's kind of my thing. And then the last thing, not related to this substantiation, is more of that broader discussion. I'm a little worried about situations where our police department is getting sucked into, hey, they're defending things, but here again, we're getting suspect to, on one of my ride-alongs, I was with the guys after there was a carjacking, a much worse serious thing that happened, and I was in my ride-along. They had a sting set up. The guys ran. We were out running around in my car that night. I think I stayed an extra hour just to watch how we did business, and it was very professional. And I remember the call came out, a black male was wearing something, and the officer in my car was really, really prudent about it. I thought he was going to pull over this guy because he fit the exact description, but there was no threat to anybody. There was no, I mean, I was ready for action, but I was and I asked some questions about that, we all know witness things, those that have taken classes. It's really interesting, the number of things. I took a witness class where my statement, even as a military pilot, was wrong, just because of the adrenaline thing. So we all know that none of us are perfect, but anyway, that's a piece of it that's a totally separate deal. But I just think that, what she's saying about, if stores for petty thefts don't have their own protection, I don't know, unless there was a threat made, or, I'm going to get you, or something like that, where the public is potentially at risk, or that store managers potentially at risk. Hey, I'm all in on that. But here again, I wasn't there, so I'm not Monday night quarterbacking this. I'm just sharing with you that it is kind of a slippery slope to be allowed to affect the credibility and the fear of our public. Here's a citizen who, just listen. I mean, I'm sure, because I've actually been in that situation before, in a different light, when I was younger. But yeah, it's just that's something more for ACPD. It's not related to the exoneration thing, but it is something that made me think a lot about human, human behavior. So, thank you.
Thank you, Lisa.
Sure. I'll try and be quick because I know that a lot of people want to talk. So I appreciate the context that ACPD gave about other incidents, but I think that you can't figure out what to make of that if you're not also collecting information about the number of times that it turns out to be nothing. right? So you're giving me 12 incidents where something bad happens. How many incidents did nothing happen? Because you absolutely need that context in order to really make a good judgment as to how concerned do I have to be here. So in collecting data, I would just put that out there. I also want to support what Gary said about bad eyewitness testimony. The police officer himself is not the person who saw what happened. So he does or should always have in his mind that something could have gone wrong. This may actually not be the person. And the feeling I got when I was watching the video was that he had already determined that this was absolutely the person and that the person was up to something nefarious. Because personally, I didn't think the guy was running. I thought he was kind of moving really quickly. But, you know, we've all been in incidents or situations where we've seen something happen where we're like, oh, holy cow, something's happening here. I wouldn't have given this guy a second thought had I been standing in the parking garage and not have known that anything was happening. It just didn't seem, you know, if you didn't know that something was happening, you just wouldn't have thought that. The other thing I think, and people have mentioned this, is the guy was wearing a tank top and really tight pants. He had nothing in his hands. He didn't have a backpack or anything else. So where was he going to be carrying some, you know, like a concealed weapon? He could have had a tiny weapon, fair enough. I don't know. I know how these things happen. But this issue about the obstructed view, and I understand why the police officer chose to be somewhere where he was a little bit hidden, made perfect sense. But then he turns around and sort of uses that as the excuse for, and that made a threat for me because I couldn't see him at every point. He could have stopped the guy before he got to the car. If he really thought this is the guy, there was enough time between when he said to him, stop, he could potentially have asked him to stop before he even got to the car. But I'm going to support in particular what Mummy said, which is that he did not have to unholster his gun and pointed at this individual. And the very last thing I'm going to say is one of the problems here with, you know, cost benefit analysis of what is going on here is there is no way of assessing the cost to that individual. And not just that individual, everyone who knows him and everyone who knows this story and how this is going to affect him going forward. And unfortunately, I feel that that gets discounted way too much. And so, you know, I understand the concerns of the police, but I'm with Mummy. If we're going to, and Gary, if we're going to allow that kind of a slippery slope because something terrible could happen, we're explicitly not taking into account the cost to society of those kinds of choices. So anyway, thank you. That was it. You're on mute.
I only want to highlight one thing that you said that really sticks out to me as, you know, in your last point about we can't capture that cost of this. I mean, again, we didn't talk as much about, you know, the complainant's behavior once he was in handcuffs and stopped, which was that he was calling out to other people in the parking lot to watch. Like the fear is really palpable. And I think that's why, you know, all of us feel like a short, you know, duration, a quickly, you know, unfolded situation requires so much attention because, you know, taking the larcenies that turned into robberies numbers out of it, we are talking about protecting a business interest over a few dollars versus the possible mistake of a possible fatal mistake and a situation where, you know, the impact on community trust, which is our kind of purview here, is increase and maintain trust between the community and ACPD, you know, in the interest of public safety is that's why this sticks out to us so badly, is that, you know, this really is an incident where the community trust has, you know, a risk of being eroded because that's the experience of somebody who didn't do anything wrong.
Can I add
sorry.
one point before
Yeah.
we go to Captain Kim, which is just to amplify, Lisa, the point that you made, which I think was really an interesting one, which is, wouldn't it have been another appropriate way? And I won't say that setting up in a car to observe was an inappropriate start to the way the officer addressed this. But wouldn't it have also been another and perhaps better way to have simply walked, driven right up to the guy and seen pretty quickly that he matches the description, and just approached him? I'm not sure, and I'd be interested to hear, what Captain Kim and Chief Penn say about that, because I don't have the specific police training, but it does go to the difference between immediately going to worst case scenario and preparing for worst case scenario, which has costs that we've just articulated, that the complainant in this case will carry that with him, and he will be talking to all kinds of other people, and it's a negative for the community. And I realize that this particular complainant didn't technically live in Arlington, but he shops in Arlington. He is a community contributor because he shops at Safeway. And I also acknowledge that these are difficult choices that do need to be made quickly. And I don't want to undercount that, because that is absolutely true. But wouldn't it have also been appropriate to just drive up to the guy? There's, again, no indication of a weapon. He appears to match the description. And if he had done that in this case, in fact, probably what would have happened would have been, oh, no, what are you talking about? and they would have had a conversation, instead of the possibility of somebody being killed. The complainant had his phone in his hand when he put his hands up, which, that's where it gets really difficult. And to just briefly jump back to the Fairfax-Tyson's incident, which was a tragic incident, and was one in which I would believe that the officer would be justified, because he believed at that point that the suspect running had a weapon in his hand as he turned towards the police, and it was dark and all that stuff. But the question then comes up, well, why did they have to get to that point already? And even in that case, it was the theft of sunglasses. And, but that's a different situation. So what I think we want to raise here is, as Mummy said and others, sort of without being naive, because look, I have been involved in law enforcement, and I know that officers provide a incredibly valuable service. They're incredibly necessary, and they do have to make very difficult decisions. But this has a negative consequence. The way this played out, this gentleman was scared to death, and there was the possibility for really bad outcomes, which didn't happen, which is great. But couldn't it have been done differently and outside the context of reasonable, which is where we're talking like, okay, we actually think that it wasn't reasonable. But again, there's a lot at stake. And the final thing I'll point out, it just minor, which was from the officer's perspective, as described just by Chief Penn, he said in his statement, I saw an altercation. Well, actually, maybe he perceived it that way, but it was not an altercation. What was actually happening was he was talking to, I think, the woman in the hijab, who was the cashier. And so I don't know what he saw, because it's not on camera, and he described it as an altercation. But I don't think any of us can say, because none of us, there was no body camera, but it wasn't an altercation. It was a discussion, and that caused him to run to the car for this completely innocent reason. So I think that's just another reason why, isn't it better to take the lowest common denominator instead of the worst possibility for all these situations? Anyway, that's all I've got.
Charles, did you want to weigh in?
Sure. Just a few things to say, because my colleagues have done, all of you just done an excellent job covering the policy, legal points and alternatives there. So more so, my comments will be about the tenor of ACVD's findings, and kind of what brings us here. David, when you were first presenting, you said how this stuff just makes you didn't feel comfortable. You didn't feel comfortable. I'm reading this and I'm saying, I don't feel safe. I don't feel safe. Why we're here, and by we, I don't just mean we as a COB. I mean also we as our partners, ACPD, because we're partners, as well as the community members here. We're partners, co-creators in this safer community. But why we are here, why we got gathered here, was because there was a national recognition finally and a community recognition that trust had evaporated. It's not as strong as it could be, that there was fear out there. If we recall with me the body-worn camera footage. I tell you, we did not hear what that altercation was, David. You're right, and I didn't remember it being regarded as an altercation. I remember it being regarded as, I said a few words to her and then I left. We didn't hear that, but I tell you what we did hear. We heard a member of our community say, "I'm scared of y'all. Y'all are the enemy." We heard a member of our community say, "You can't understand my frustration. You can never understand my frustration." We heard a member of our community say, "You trying to Black Lives Matter me?" It goes to why we were gathered here, because the trust in so many parts of our community has eroded, you know? We're here to help rebuild that trust. We're here to show the good and the plenty of good out there that our policing does. We're here to be co-creators in our community of policing, good policing and good policies that undergird that. The report and mentality behind the report that came out of ACPD on this demonstrates to me why we will have to continue to be here. Because the findings, the interpretation of existing policy, and the mentality around that, to me, sound tone deaf to the issues of community trust, safety, and racial bias that bring us here. I do not want what we do every month, or, Julie, like you said, twice this month, twice next month. I don't want this to devolve into a, this is how we found, and we're going to just justify it. And thanks for weighing in, COB. That's not what this ever was meant to be. This was meant to be a co-creation in something better, because we recognized how policies and practice were falling short of building that trust. But I am not hearing that from all of our partners, that recognition. I'm not. Perhaps if we're throwing out suggestions, perhaps we even how the paper trail of what we're doing is presented. Ours has to include recommendations. Perhaps ACPD's needs to have a section for recommendations in their findings when they conclude. So, you know what? We've concluded our investigation and we may find X, Y, and Z, but we also are going to spend some time ourselves looking at, our policy and practice. And and there's a little section here that says how we understand that this may not be putting us in the best as we could be for policing. But I don't see that yet. I just see a retrenchment, which gives me the idea, and it may not be the case, but it gives me the idea that the understanding is, well, all this that we do is correct. David, you said you're not comfortable. David, I don't feel safe. Why? Because a gun was pointed. There's one step left. It's not that I just don't feel safe for that man or people who look like me. I happen to look like him. I don't feel safe for those people in the safe way. I don't feel if the justification was, oh, because there's crime in this area. Oh, Arlington community, please watch when you shop around, Pentagon City. What I heard in my ride-alongs is Pentagon City has a lot of these type of crimes, these type of shoplifting type crimes. So if we're setting out the idea that pointing a gun for this type of crime is okay, then my goodness, do I have to worry about when I go down to Pentagon Row, Pentagon City? When I stop at the local 7-Eleven? Oh, because a lot of the folks looked like. Oh my gosh, really? They steal a candy bar and I get a bullet. Wow. Oh, Charles, you're too far, too emotional. No. One step away. One step away. There were a lot of well-meaning people in a lot of communities. Thank goodness it stopped where it stopped. But when we set up a situation where we okay this, which I'm fearful that's what the ACPD report will do, that's what it will show, especially when there's a staunch defense. I have not even heard ACPD yet, and there is still time. I have not heard them say, well, we do hear you, maybe, let's co-create on this. I haven't heard that yet. I have just heard justification, and a running to a county attorney. Oh my. Now we've handled other stuff here. Now, granted, this is only first of a few cases, but running to a county attorney for this? So there must have been some thinking behind the severity of this. I'm leaving it at that. I'm gonna move past that. So I know we're short in time, but like I said, colleagues, you've done such a good job covering all the other salient things. But one other thing that I want to put out there is, in our ride-alongs, that you mentioned the ride-alongs there, we're reminded of on what things they could code. You turn on those lights and sirens and stuff. As my understanding was put into my head from the various ride-alongs I went along, we could not code on the stealing of energy drinks because of their cost, because this was not a violent taking of energy. That would not, if that person were to get, if that person was doing a 100-yard dash, got in that car and drove away, there could not be a code high-speed chase on that car because of the nature of that crime and the potential danger to the community of a high-speed chase. So if I can't get in the car and chase him, I can pull a gun and potentially shoot him. I don't see the logic. Now, maybe I'm misunderstanding who we can chase, but I don't see that. Again, thank you. My colleagues, you just covered everything else. Thanks.
Charles, thank you for your remarks. I think that they are exactly why we wanted volunteers and citizens representative. I think all of us experienced an emotional reaction to the body-worn camera footage, but we don't all experience the same emotional reaction. And in, going through these conversations, part of what and I think this is a good transition into our second, conversation about bias-free policing, which is that, taking the current events and the recent crime statistics into account, we do have to kind of gut check ourselves and ask about how does bias and implicit bias play a factor into these decisions. So I really appreciate your remarks. I don't always want to lean on you to be able to make them. And, I think we're still kind of practicing how to open up the summary. I think, from our COB members, from ACPD, from Mummy and Ian, we're getting, more input and feedback on how do we want to frame this out. When I do stuff for the court for, other situations, we have very fact-based things, but I really appreciate you bringing our attention back to the reason that we're here is that we are the members of the community being protected. And if we don't feel safe in the way that we're being protected, then we have, issues to resolve. So I do want to go to bias-free policing before we vote on both because I think that there is, an interrelationship between, what drives excessive use of force or use of force in this scenario. So I do want to get to that.
I see Captain Kim's hand.
I was going to say, I'm going to ask Captain Kim to weigh in, and then at 7:50, I want to take a quick break, and then we'll do bias-free policing. Dave, I'm going to lean on you to do another exceptional job framing out the policy, and then we'll go into discussion. But I do want to give Captain Kim and ACPD a chance to open to address, the many comments that were made since your input.
We'll wait till you are able to have your discussion and then weigh in at the end, I guess, prior to the vote. So just want to give
Okay.
everyone an opportunity to speak. That's fine.
Thank you. Okay, before we take a break, I want to ask Anika and Jim if they have any comments they want to make on the kind of first half of this conversation.
No comment from me.
Okay. If Fatima is able to weigh in, I'm happy to see her join our meetings. We do have an opportunity for public comment on our agenda, but that's not our plan for this kind of current portion. So I'm going to go ahead and say that we will come back at 8:52. We'll take a 5-minute break. We'll come back and we'll talk about biosphere policing.
7:52, right?
That's exactly what I meant. I didn't say it, but you are. This is why I work. This is why we work in pairs, and so I like working with you.
Okay, 5 minutes.
Welcome back. Okay, I'm just gonna give folks one more minute. And I'm gonna ask the COB members to come on camera just so we know you're back. Excellent, thank you. And I wanna acknowledge to our community member, James Younger, who has his hand raised, that we will take public comment at 8:40. Okay, Anika, are you around before we resume?
Did you say my name?
Yeah, sorry, I just wanted to make sure you were
Yes,
back.
I am. Yes.
Awesome, cool. Okay, we've got everybody back. Thank you so much for entertaining a break and a long and in-depth discussion. It's definitely why we're here. It's important that we dig into this, and I know there aren't always we're not always going to come to consensus, but we do want to strengthen our understanding. So as we get into this second section, I'm just going to open up bias-free policing, the involvement here being related to the complainant's race. And Dave, I'm going to have you go over the policies, and then we'll do the same thing. We'll kind of give our remarks. We'll let OPR weigh in, the IPA weigh in, and then we'll have a group discussion. And then once we've kind of concluded those, we'll do a little bit of a summary of discussion points and take a vote on our recommendations for each.
Okay, sure. All right. So
Thank
let
you.
me just read the policy first. The definition of bias and bias-based policing and stereotypes is what I want to read. So the definition of bias is in the policy: a tendency, inclination, or prejudice toward or against something or someone, often based on stereotypes rather than actual knowledge of an individual or circumstances, that can result in prejudgments that lead to imprudent decisions or discriminatory practices. Okay, and stereotype is a belief that an identifiable group of persons all share similar values and behavioral characteristics, rather than focusing on the unique personality or disposition of an individual. And bias-based policing is defined as a law enforcement initiated action based on race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, economic status, religious beliefs, age, or other bias, rather than an individual's behavior or other information identifying the individual as having engaged in criminal activity. And the policy states that the department is committing to ensuring that its activities are conducted in an unbiased manner. What's not explicitly stated in the policy in terms of the definition of bias is whether the bias needs to be front of mind or that the actor needs to be conscious of the bias. And my response to this is that that's what it's trying to get at. It's trying to get at something that is deliberate, something that the actor, the officer, is aware of, because I think that's an important factor to get at. And I don't think, in looking at the circumstances of this case, that the officer had any conscious bias in his mind. I mean, the discussion of it during the interview was perfunctory. I will say that. He stated that he didn't have any conscious bias, and I have no reason to disbelieve him on that. There's no reason for me to think that that's untrue. However, I think there's a lot to discuss here. And I'm going to start out by saying, at least from my perspective, because I didn't see anything in the 17 pieces of evidence that were collected for this case, which I reviewed all of them, indicated to me that the officer consciously was intending to single out this suspect / complainant consciously because of his race. So I would be comfortable either with a not sustained finding or an exoneration, and we can discuss that. However, the question that is behind all of this is, would this have happened the same way if a 20-year-old white female were the description of the suspect was for a 20-year-old white female? And when I sit here and think about it, I'm just hard pressed to say, yeah, it would have happened exactly the same way. I mean, we can discuss it, and this is, again, to the points that we've all made. This is the valuable thing about having this forum to discuss. We are partners with ACPD. I don't think there's any bad faith or any reason to believe that the officer or anybody involved in this case has anything negatively conscious in their mind. But I do feel like there is an implicit, unconscious bias that led, or that could have led, the officer to see the objective facts in this case as more dangerous than they were. If there were other indications that there was, some tattoo, or there's some reason to think that the suspect had some affiliation with a gang or anything else, but there wasn't. And what we know actually happened was, this was a guy who had a day job. He had a suit in the car, and he's working a second job. It's just a completely innocent explanation. And the harm that we discussed earlier occurred. And fortunately, nothing else happened, which makes this a perfect case to discuss this, because again, it didn't result in the kind of harm that might have happened. But not to say that there wasn't lasting fear and a negative consequence as a result of what did happen. But I just think it's worth talking about the issue of implicit bias. It's a difficult issue because it's not conscious, but I do think that we can make efforts to assess this situation and tease it out. And that's why we really wanted to look at the objective factors. Really, what were the objective factors that might have justified the action? And I didn't see them, and I don't believe that they were there. But I do think it's important to talk through, what was it that really triggered this? And I think it's a fair question to say that sadly, as a result of a variety of things, for whatever reason, the officer believed that the situation was more dangerous than it was, because it was a black male. I mean, I think that's, again, implicitly, not consciously. And I think it's a really nuanced and difficult thing to talk through. Like, okay, well, what do you do with that? Because if you're saying it's not conscious and you're not willing to say that there's a policy violation, which I'm not, what do you do about it? But I think that's where we should have a valuable conversation. So that's what I've got on this.
Thank you. Thank you. The only things I want to highlight additionally before we give OPR a chance to weigh in is, in the definition of bias-based policing, the thing that sticks out to me is a law enforcement initiated action based on race. And so as we're reviewing this specific policy, and Dave, you and I went back and forth on exonerated versus not sustained, I think that very clearly the officer's response to the individual was based on a very similar appearance as the description, which was specific and not limited to race. And so I'm not inclined to think that in this policy violation consideration, that allegation can be, I guess I'm pointing to the specific policy language, but I also want to draw attention to the specific kind of investigation of the involvement of race in the decision-making beyond the initiation, where, Dave, as you mentioned, that the questions to explore whether or not bias were involved in the officer's decision-making are direct and unlikely to reveal any conscious bias in this setting, in the setting of an interview, in the setting of an after action, that there may be opportunities for improvement of how do we explore whether or not we have implicit or explicit bias in a situation having nothing to do with a question about did the person's race affect your decision making? Like, I don't think anyone's going to say yes to that. But what I know personally is that if I get involved with the police and my reaction is frustration or anger or angst, or I'm late, or, this is an annoyance, I'm not regarded in the same kind of manner. And so in this instance, where the person was immediately compliant and visibly, responded to the officer's commands, I think we do have other conversation to have here around the role of bias in the stipulation of reasonable use of force versus excessive use of force, because this is a balance of what is the risk to the officer, what is the risk to the community, and what is the risk to this innocent person who happened to match the description of, something else. So I want to kick it over to OPR to provide their input on the kind of bias-free policing. And then, Mummy, I'll have you weigh in before we hear from the rest of the COB and have kind of a broader discussion. But that was the part that stuck out to me, is that, the difference between me reacting very badly as a white woman and feeling frustrated or angsty isn't going to raise as much alarm as, in this instance, a Black man who matched the description kind of through no fault of his own, and certainly not the fault of the officers, that, the compliance still was met with a very serious act that resulted in, this person being scared for their life. So I want to give OPR a chance to weigh in on what we're talking about with the policy, and then what we're talking about with the implications of bias on the first consideration of policy when we're talking about use of force.
Okay, thanks. So there's a couple of points that I just wanted to go back to. There are a couple of questions I think that came up during the conversation. And just to clarify, the point in providing the data about the other cases is that's important in considering what can be going through an officer's mind during an encounter. I mean, that was the point in sharing that information. The question was asked specifically by driving right up to a person. This is something that officers are trained not to do. It puts yourself at a disadvantage because you're sitting in a car. So we're trained not to do that for safety concerns, because even though there was no mention of a weapon in the call for service, I mean, it doesn't always mean that there's not one. So that people are trained not to do that. One of the things that I remember, even from my training forever ago, at the academy, they did a demonstration to prove to us, to show us about, the speed of action versus reaction. And the drill was, one recruit officer was pointing a fake gun at the other, and the other person decided whenever they wanted to pull the weapon that they had from their holster, point it and fire it. And it showed that it's about at the same time. So I think that's just a training thing I share with you. The standards by which the uses of force are judged, it has been set by the United States Supreme Court. I mean, we can always have policy discussions and further conversations, but in this matter, there's no, fact basis to determine or suggest that the officer had a conscious or subconscious bias that impacted what happened. We've had training across the agency on bias, and we're certainly happy to have a later conversation around future trainings and what would be helpful. But we still have to be guided by what the law is surrounding this. Did I miss?
Nope. Thank you.
That's it.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, sorry. I was taking I was taking notes and I wanted to make sure I didn't cut you off. Okay, since we're going to circle back and then I want to open the floor up and I know we'll circle back. I do want to give you guys a chance to address two specific things. Was there a use of force review on this before the complaint came in?
No, so the complaint came in 2 days after the incident. So the timeline, there was just a very short period of time that was done in between the complaint and the incident date.
Okay. Is that something you can share with the IPA and or COB?
Share what?
The use of force.
You asked me, was a use of force review completed on this incident? The answer is no.
Oh, okay. I thought, sorry. I thought in the initial response that you guys said that before the complaint came in, you guys review these things and that's how you talked about this with the Commonwealth Attorney.
No, nope, no, that is not, no.
Okay,
Not the sequence of events as it occurred.
We wanted to clarify that point. And then I do want to give you a chance to react to, you know, what we're, I think all kind of feeling about the general sentiment around the policy and the situation and the specific tension here that, you know, this inclination to look at the policy and say, was this legal versus is there an opportunity here to identify proactively situations that bring us very close to not just a dangerous, but a fatal mistake and the experience of this community member who was scared for his life, who, you know, was calling for help, who was clearly under a race-based, you know, fear of this situation with Arlington County Police. And I just thought you guys might have something you wanted to add.
I mean,
real quick, Julie, if I can just jump in really quick, Julie, to clarify, I don't believe it was a Commonwealth attorney, but I do believe, Robert, Kim, you mentioned the county attorney review, and perhaps that's something that could be shared.
So,
Thank you,
Julie,
Charles.
you had a couple of questions. I just want to address that. I mean, you just fired over. So, number one is, you know, you talked about looking at this from a policy and a legal perspective. So, you know, those that are attorneys on the board understand that is the lens that we initially have to look through things. We have a policy. That policy is guided by law. Those laws are guided by Supreme Court decisions. That is the lens that we initially have to look at things. Now, you talk about, is there room for a discussion on a policy, like modifications, adaptations, discussions? We continue to have those discussions all the time about making improvements to the way that we do and handle and conduct business. And I think, you know, one of the things that was brought out earlier was this idea about, you know, is there a better way to capture the data in regards to pointing a firearm? And yes, I believe that there is a mechanism that we need be able to implement that allows us to better view this data. So those types of things we are always internally looking at, and then having these discussions with you allow us, you know, at least for me, to sort of conceptualize, understand, take into consideration, and then perhaps down the road have further discussions about these things. And so I hope that was a way of me answering the question about policy and law, and then, you know, the lenses that we look through, and then how we can sort of take those things and then make those improvements in the future.
Yes. I want to follow back to Charles' question about, is there something from the county attorney review of this situation that we can review?
No. No,
Okay.
This was just a discussion that we had with the county attorney's office about this particular incident. And it was just a verbal discussion that we had.
Okay.
With
The
you.
recollection from that verbal discussion that was that the county attorney was in full agreement with what the department's findings were. That was your recollection of that conversation?
Yes. 100% full agreement, yes.
Mummy, I want to give you a chance to weigh in on the bias-free policing element, and then the questions that we've raised since then, and then I'll open up to the COB to weigh in on some of these additional issues.
Thanks, Julie. Apologies for being off camera. I'm getting plasma down for the evening. You know, going back to the first part of your discussion about not sustained versus exonerated, I too kind of struggled with that question. You know, let me just say from a personal perspective, you know, Captain Kim and I have these discussions all the time, you know, when we are first looking at footage and you know, figuring out what the interview strategy is going to be and what allegations. But my first response was, you know, this video is not easy to watch. This was hard to watch. And I think, you know, what we're all feeling here, or what, you know, those who have voiced the concerns are feeling, is that like this just was very uncomfortable, did not feel, you know, safe. It just it raises up a lot of, you know, feelings that we may have personally, that this is not right. And it's like something that you can sometimes like feel, but can't quite put your finger on it and see. And I think this is kind of one of those circumstances. But looking at the situation completely objectively in my, you know, professional lens, obviously, like my lived experience always informs my perspective on these issues, particularly from a policy standpoint. But looking at it from the allegation standpoint, initially, I was zeroing in on the bias-free policing piece as it pertained to the stop initially, the stop itself, right? And where the officer initiated contact with the complainant. And I think in that instance, that I, you know, alluded to earlier, it may have very well just been the store manager actually profiling this individual and giving the description of this particular person. Like, for all we know, he could have been like, oh, that must be him, and gave the exact description that matched him, because it was an exact match for the description. So for that reason, I could certainly not make any sort of personal or professional conclusion that the officer exhibited some sort of racial bias in stopping the complainant. What then made me go to, so that's why initially I was looking at exonerated, but what then made me decide on not sustained instead of exonerated, because the definition for exonerated is, you know, actions occurred but were within policy or legal. Where I focused on the not sustained part was, there's kind of like two parts of this bias policing piece. It's not just the stop, but it was also the escalation of the use of force that I think had some potential subconscious bias or implicit bias that may have played a factor in it, whether that was the analysis of what level of threat this young man posed as a young Black man with dreads running back and forth to his car, or whatever other reason. And I think the problem is, first of all, I would not feel professionally comfortable with sustaining an allegation just based on, you know, what you think could have happened or a feeling or anything of that. Like, there has to be clear evidence beyond a preponderance of the evidence for me to sustain an allegation or recommend a sustained allegation. But I do think, because of the fact that there were some additional factors that may have been there could have been some additional factors at play that caused the use of force to be escalated beyond what I thought would have been objectively reasonable, which we never really got to the bottom to, because I think of the way that we are approaching bias-free policing, like, and questions around bias-free policing in the investigation, which I'll get to in a second. But the definition of not sustained is there was not enough evidence to either prove or disprove. And that's where I landed on this particular one, because I do think that there is some subconscious bias to unpack here. Again, I want to amplify what Dave said. Like, I did not feel that this officer went into this encounter with the intent to, you know, racially profile this individual or act in any sort of racially biased way. At least I didn't get that, I didn't get that impression from anything that I observed. But I think the other part of it is, we have to find better ways to pick up on indicators of implicit bias, because what is still happening here is the impact, even if the intent wasn't there. And what we need to figure out is, you know, what are some of the things that are leading us to draw like conclusions that may or may not be actually based in, you know, some sort of objective standard that you would have the exact same perception if it was someone else. And I think, you know, many of us have said it, that it's hard to imagine that this same circumstance would have happened if the race or gender was different in this scenario. So that's why I think not sustained was more appropriate in this situation. I think we can't just be looking for instances where someone is called a blatant racial slur, or, you know, like, you know, something just really obvious like that, to be thinking and asking these questions, because there are things called microaggressions, and they happen all the time in our daily lives, in our workspaces, certainly in policing. And that's what I think gets to the heart of the conversation about these implicit biases. And I think what we really need to focus in on here is like the training around implicit bias. And I think, you know, looking at this circumstance, it did not seem to me as like a clear intent, but more so an issue of education. And when I say education, I mean unlearning some of the things that are, you know, subconsciously affecting how we assess a situation. And so I think I would love to see some more robust training, and it made the recommendation in my report that I would like to see the department expand their training around subconscious bias. And I would also like to specifically make a recommendation that in the administrative investigation process, that the questions around racial bias or any sort of bias-free policing allegation be expanded. I've sat in on a couple of them now, and you know, I like to look at a couple of them before I make any sort of assessments. But the general kind of standard is, you know, an officer is asked, you know, were any of your actions in this incident at all impacted by the person's race or gender, or whatever the, you know, underlying bias allegation is. And I've never heard someone say yes. You know, it is this instinctive answer is going to be no, because it's a yes or no question. Instead, I think we need to find ways to ask questions that are going to help us unpack the way that these situations are being assessed, and what is leading to any sort of disparities in how officers, in their tones, how quickly they're apprehending people, how quickly they're being ordered out of the vehicles, how quickly they're being put in handcuffs, how situations may be escalated in certain circumstances and not others. I think the more we delve into that, and the more data we collect around this, the better kind of questions we can ask that will help to uncover these. And I think it's just important to remember, like, the focus here is not to pinpoint any specific officer's conduct. I certainly don't think that this officer, as I said, was going into the situation trying to exhibit, you know, racially biased behavior. I think it's more about, as I said earlier, unlearning some of the, you know, ways that we are, you know, the societal kind of implications, and the way that we are educated around race and some of our biases, a lot of which we are not always even conscious of. So I think we definitely need to tap into that if there's going to be any sort of shift around how these allegations are handled, and also how we can prevent these sort of situations from happening. The other thing I wanted to say is that I think policy should certainly be guided by law, but I don't think that there's any exclusion to allowing policy to be guided by both law and best practice, policy informed by community, informed by, you know, safe practices, and what people want to see their police department look and act and feel like. So we can't just look at it within the lens of the law. I think the law definitely is an important, you know, foundation for it, but where the law doesn't, and I think also another important thing that I wanted to say is, specifically with policies around use of force, or I'll just use it as an example since this is the case, the scenario, it is kind of hard to outline a policy that can specifically anticipate every possible scenario. So you have to find the right balance of, like, you can't create a policy that is going to be so specific or so restrictive that it then does not give the officer an opportunity to do what they need to do in a circumstance where maybe their safety is at risk or what have you. We also can't not provide enough guidance to where, or even at the very least, supervision in the form of an administrative review. And just to be clear, it is my understanding that an administrative review a review of this would not have happened but for this complaint because of the way that the policy is structured. And so that is I think the point there, which is that we can't craft good policy if we're not assessing the underlying conduct and figuring out where the standard should be. So that's what I have to say on the bias-free policing allegation, and then just kind of, generally bringing it back around to shaping policy. I hopefully answered the questions that you posed, Julie, but if I didn't, please feel free to let me know.
You did. I got to them. I'll, Dave, if you want to add anything else, or the rest of the COB, I would welcome y'all's comment on bias and bias-free policing before we move to a vote.
I'd just like to amplify the point that Mummy just made, which is two things. One, discretion with the officer is always going to exist. And that's to Charles's point, we are here co-creating with ACPD a way to sort of improve the guidelines that guide the discretion. But discretion will always exist. And second, I actually think that Mummy's point on this would never have been reviewed but for the complaint is really worth looking at, because from my perspective, and we will vote on this, but I mean, I think from what we've heard from COB as community members, this is a significant matter and it deserves review. Exactly when to draw and point a firearm. Again, we're not going to be able to pinpoint it in every situation. There has to be discretion, and we understand that. But this actually raised a lot of issues, and I think even what we've had so far has been valuable back and forth. But I would like to be able to continue it with ACPD over time as we gather more information and see what happened, in terms of data collecting. And we don't want to throw a huge administrative burden on them, but by the same token, knowing more about the data would be helpful. And Lisa made a really good point about we don't know how many times a larceny ended up as just a larceny. Those are, over time, we'll get there. But this has really been, for me, a really valuable conversation.
Thank you. Yeah, I appreciated Lisa's input on that too. We have to have balanced data collection so that we can be informed by a neutral context and not a context that intentionally or incidentally steers us in the sentiment of fear and excessive force. Lisa?
Thanks, Julie. Yeah, and thank you, Dave, because that's what I wanted to touch on quickly again. When, because Chief Penn brought up the issue again of the 12 incidents and, the context. And when I said, I hope you're also collecting the data on when it turned out to be nothing, or nothing that would have required, somebody to pull a gun, I meant that sincerely. And the reason I'm saying that is because people are notoriously terrible at attaching realistic probabilities to outcomes. And this has been very well established. The human brain is not good at this. We overweight our personal experiences or the personal experiences of people we know. If you want better outcomes, you need better data. So collecting these sorts of data and actually looking at them so that people understand, well, what was the realistic probability based on the data that X is going to happen as opposed to Y is going to happen. And you're not just doing it based on these 12 terrible incidents happened, and now they're in my head and I'm constantly afraid that something bad is going to happen. So that, I just wanted to mention that. But the other thing I wanted to mention, again, going back to data, and I appreciate we did have a really good conversation a while back, Ian and I did, with ACPD around data. I hope we can keep having those conversations, because I know there are concerns about privacy issues of looking at certain kinds of data, but people can get bonded, or people can get security clearances, or there are ways of getting realistic access to information, because if we can't see the information, we're never going to be able to get to the right sort of data and analysis that we all need to make better decisions. So I appreciated that conversation, and I hope we just keep having it. And that's all I want to say. Thanks.
Thank you. Team?
Yeah, this is Gary. Thank you. Thank you for everybody's comments. I'll keep this quick. So obviously, this is not just something for our county, it's the whole nation. This is a very difficult topic. We know that it impacts everything, not just our nation, around the world. But so now, but we're charged with our county here, Arlington County, to make this county as good as we can. So, and I know that a lot of laws control this, but as I was looking, I guess one of the questions that I have for ACPD, and I think I know the answer because you got everything inside of the law, definitely understands why this whole thing was exonerated. And so it's the method that we start this journey. So just as Mummy said, the interview, when I looked through the report, the interviewer asked them, hey, was anything based on race? And of course, it doesn't matter where you are in the world. It's like, why ask that question? I mean, who's going to, that's just like, come on, we're much older than that, but we're required to ask that question. But in the context of what we're trying to do, I just think we can do better than that. So I'm going to go back to the data. So in this case, I remember the officer, this is just an example, and I'm not saying this data is correct, but the officer, used the F word. Now, I don't know what precipitated it, and I do know that I was reading some things like his behavior was professional, and so I was looking at that, and I go, man, in my career, I don't know if I would have got a professional behavior for that. But anyway, I understand in tense situations, that's normal. In high threat things, that's a normal thing. I didn't see the high threat that leads that human behavior. But in the sense of data, I was asking myself, is that the kind of thing to capture? Is other behaviors during an event? I mean, what if there was data that showed in certain like the number of officers that throughout the F word or whatever, there's a correlation, whether it's Hispanics or whatever. Maybe it's nothing, but I'm just falling on this theme. If we're satisfied with just asking a question, a yes or no answer, but we don't try to unpack and put tick marks on other indicators that we're allowed to within the legal system and Privacy Act and all those kind of things, I just think that we can all get a little bit more, as we go down this journey, and it's a national journey, but we have our county here. That's what we're charged to do. And so I'd want to be a leader rather than a follower within the bounds of legal things. But I think there's more we can unpack here than just asking a yes or no question.
Thank you. Team? Oh, you can't unmute. Sorry, Charles. I'm going to try this. Oh, can you do it now? Try now. Quick, before it changes.
Yes, I can. Gary.
Sorry, Ian, that was definitely my fault.
Again, colleagues, you've pretty much covered it. Gary, yes, asking that direct question. I was thinking to myself, is this like the last 15 minutes of Law and Order? You just ask the one question and then everything's admitted. That's just not how life works. And a lot of that's because, again, part of the recognition that brought us here is that systemic racism is a thing. Racism is deeply ingrained in societal structures. But the thing is, acknowledging that bias threatens the status quo because it requires systemic change, and that's hard. So sometimes it's just easier to maintain that existing order. Why we're here, colleagues, why we're here, ACPD, why we're here, members of the community joining us, because we recognize that. But again, part of that co-creation is to get past zero-sum thinking of bias, that if you admit that there is a bias, then you're the worst person. There's no coming back from that. We have to be able to admit that it does have an impact. And like you were saying, Lisa, like you were saying, David, that these things, like you were saying, Julie, these things often manifest as implicit bias, that you're not harboring this, consciously, but this is unconscious bias, that happens. And many of us, have this in this unconscious, awareness. The perfunctory way the questions were asked, I don't think that leads to exonerating that bias has an impact. Was there bias in stopping? No. Was there bias in pulling a gun? I can see where there is bias there, and that's where my thinking is. What I would like to see from ACPD, because we're talking about data, I would like to the extent that the data is there, and if the data is not there, I would like to know, affirmatively that no, it's not there. And, could it, how could we go about making it be there in the future? But I would like to know, how many times were guns pulled in 2023? For what crimes and on whom by race and gender? That is information that I am formally asking. And I would like a response to that just into 2023. And if that information is not available, just why it's not, and what steps could be taken in the future to make that information available. So multi-pronged there. That's what I'm asking. But I do agree with the recommendations that Mami put forward with regard to this bias section. Again, that robust training, not just for our officers, but also by those that are tasked in OPR by reviewing how our officers' conduct is. I think that is very essential too. And that would be a nice refresher there. I know that was already shared with us, Lieutenant Kim, with regard to the training that some of the staff is. But if you could just refresh our recollection again, you don't have to do it tonight, maybe just something written that kind of shares with us within your office the training that you all receive and at what intervals when it comes to not only bias training, but just training and best practices, so to make sure that as you all do these reviews of policies, it's reviewing what those best standards are. And again, I know that you've touched on that in our initial training, but it'd be nice to help refresh my recollection of those things. Thank you. That's all my comments.
Thank you, Charles. I think there are kind of two follow-up elements that we are also happy to participate in as the COB. One, which is that we're acknowledging that we have this sense that the data related to pointing of a firearm at someone is going to be a very useful tool for increasing and maintaining trust with the community and avoiding fatal mistakes. So that's one thing that we are happy to help explore: what research, what practice, what policy, what legislation is in place, and those kinds of elements. I think the other side of that is a larger conversation about how do we make data. We recognize that data is a logistical effort. It's a cost. It's a consideration, but it pales in comparison to the cost that we're talking about when we're looking at how do we equip officers with a full picture, right, of what's going on in the community and what is my level of risk, because they need to be equipped, right, to walk around with weapons. And that can't be at a disproportionate advantage in different situations in either way. So I want to invite final comments from Jim, Lisa, or Anika on this before I make the investigation lead's recommendations and hear motions to adopt or not. Thank you.
No other comments from me. Everyone covered. Incredible job, great discussion, and look forward to the dialogue continuing.
Thank you, Jim. Okay, so for the first allegation relating to a violation of ACPD use of force policy, David and I's finding is based on the officer's actions of a serious act pointing the weapon at someone, the policy stipulating that they can tactically justify their action, and that when we go through the criteria and we go through his response in the officer's response in the interview, that we didn't find that information to tactically justify the action, given that it was, small scale larceny, given that it wasn't a threat, to the community, given that he was trying to flee, given that he was very compliant and visibly compliant, and that the dynamics of the situation, while, it was quick and it was rapidly changing, and in some regards, there were no specifically identified risks or indicators from that the officer identified in his tactical justification of the actions in his interview. And so we find this to be an excessive use of force, and we recommend sustaining the allegation of a violation of use of force policy. So I will hear a motion on our first recommendation to adopt.
So moved by Charles to adopt the recommendation.
Thank you. Do you have a second?
I'll second it.
Thank you. All in favor, aye. Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed, say nay. Any abstentions? Any guy, I hate to do this, but I didn't hear what your answer was, and I want to make sure Ian can record your vote.
It's aye.
Thank you. Well, I should just let you go first. Okay, so we adopt the recommendation to sustain the violation of ACPD's use of force policy. Moving to bias-free policing, our recommendation is that this finding is not sustained. While we don't believe that this was, while we think it's clear that this was not initiated by racial bias, we can't, from the available evidence, eliminate the possibility that the officer's actions to escalate the situation were not motivated by bias, and that at the time there was not specific information to tactically justify the actions. And so without being able to exonerate or sustain, we make a recommendation of not sustaining this allegation, and we'll hear a motion to adopt our recommendation or not.
I'll move to adopt it and add to your great description that it includes in our/understanding the possibility that implicit bias, that is non-conscious bias, was a motivating factor.
Thank you. Second?
Second.
All in favor, say aye and give any a chance to answer first.
Aye.
Aye. All opposed, nay? Any abstentions? Gary abstains. Wonderful. Okay, so we will move to adopt the not sustained finding for the second, not unanimously. So we have a couple of other agenda items, but before we kind of close this out, I want to thank members of the public for participating today, sticking with us through a long and involved conversation. That is certainly, part of the intent of this body. I want to thank the IPA and their office for all of their help kind of prepping us for this, and ACPD's making time to have conversations with us about this investigation review. I do really want to emphasize that I think we all remain committed to this process being part of building and increasing understanding so that we can build and increase our tools that make us all feel safe, that make us all capable of, increasing and maintaining trust. And we are still on the front of that journey. So this has been, I think, a very, very rich and rewarding discussion. I know that consensus is just not always going to be achievable, but if we can all walk away feeling a little bit more empathetic and informed about the perspectives, here and the balance of risk and power that we're maintaining here. I want to echo what Charles said, that a lot of what's motivating this body's work specifically is a need for systemic change. And what that looks like in Arlington is partially, what this board here is here to serve that purpose. And it's not always easy, but it doesn't have to be difficult if we can hear and be heard by each other to increase, our access to other people's perspectives. And I think that's how we do our job as the COB, to increase and maintain trust. So thank you everyone for, reviewing the information and taking the time out of your regular lives and regular programming, especially the COB members, but also, members of the public, for joining us. This is really, really important. And I think we're building, positive momentum and process, and I hope that only gets better. So again, please feel free to reach out and engage with us. I am 2 minutes past, but I think we're going to move to public comment. Ian, did we have specific requests for public comment tonight? Oh, you're on mute.
What about now?
Yes.
Great. Love technology. There were no requests put in prior to the meeting.
Okay. We did have a hand raised, and so I wanted to make time, maybe 4 minutes for folks from the audience who've joined us that were interested in speaking earlier. I want to make sure we have space for comment here. Please raise your hand if you'd like to join us in the conversation. Otherwise, we will move on to our IPA report out. JD, Julius, thank you for joining us tonight. I think we have to allow mic. Oh, sorry. Ian, I'm just going to leave it to you. I keep screwing up. So
Mr. Smith, you should be able to unmute now. You should be able to unmute, sir.
Nope, not yet.
For some reason, Julie, it seemed to not work when I would do it, but it worked when you were doing it.
Okay, let me try.
Currently, he's allowed to unmute, but it's not allowing him to actually.
Let's try that now. JD, can you unmute? No. I'm going to try one more time, Ian.
Okay.
Allow mic. Can we try again to unmute JD? Oh, shoot. Okay, hold on. See if the little icon changed. No? Ian, would you mind closing the screen sharing so I can
His
see
icon did change, Julie. So maybe he can now. He would have to. Now he has to unmute himself.
Yes.
His icon changed from not being able to unmute himself to now being able to unmute himself. But now he has to unmute. He has to do the last part himself.
Mr. Spain, if you try Control-Shift-M, that may work. Maybe it's the button.
Our favorite part of the meeting.
I know. No. Okay, well, we'll have a serious conversation with our IT people tomorrow morning.
He's going to leave and come back in. Thank you.
Ian, are you able to maybe change the setting like all together? Right, okay, perfect.
See if we can do it when he rejoins us.
I think I also saw a hand earlier from Mr. Younger. I'm not sure if he still wanted to give comment or not. And then we also have a hand from Bethany Bonsu.
Okay. 1 second. Let's see if we can.
You can hear me now.
We can. You have the floor.
Apologies for that, Mr. Smith.
How about that? Well, look, I know I came in late. It's been a really I wanted to see this from the beginning, but like I said last month, I just want to commend each and every one of you for your hard work. I just have a special relationship with everything that's going on here, being that we've been following it for a number of years. So it's some long, arduous work, and I'm liking that you're working closely with the police department. You know, transparency and accountability are big in our community. So again, I just want to give you a shout out from doing a really good job. We may not always agree at the end of the day, but finding ways to compromise and improve ourselves is always better than anything else. So just a shout out and thank you for what you're doing.
Thank you so much for joining us and for making time to participate. James, thank you for your hand earlier. We appreciate you sticking around. We'd love to hear from you, and then we'll hear from our last raised hand, Bethany.
I'm James Young. I'm Vice President of Arlington NAACP, and as a former 30 member of Arlington Police Department, I really appreciate your thorough analysis of the investigation. And I particularly like the idea that was brought up in terms of capturing data on all displays of weapons, because display of a firearm, particularly to an innocent person, can be very, very traumatic. And in fact, some years ago, one of our most distinguished detectives who was working undercover, driving home through another jurisdiction, was stopped at gunpoint. And he suffered almost PTSD for probably the next couple of years. So even though he had been involved in hundreds of arrests and was a police officer, he still suffered a traumatic experience. So you can imagine, what happens to innocent civilians. So I hope that you continue to pursue a change in that particular policy. And I think this type of board is really good for fine tuning everything the Arlington Police Department does, and in terms of making policies much, much better.
Thank you so much. Thank you for joining us, and thank you for the reminder, which is that I do want to especially thank Dave on this one for really going above and beyond and laying out kind of the parameters of how to analyze this very nuanced, very complicated, very important review. I think everyone on the board brings lots of really valuable specific perspective, skills, and experience, and we get the chance to collaborate in these pairs. And I am tremendously grateful for, that support, but also for my, ability to learn from y'all. And so I think we do that in every meeting from each other. But Dave, I certainly really feel like we can up level our prep in a couple of different ways because of the really exceptional job you did. And I just want to recognize you and say thank you for that. And thank you to all of the COB members for bringing your kind of expertise, your personality, and your experience to help represent the community. So, James, thank you for highlighting that. I don't want to forget to acknowledge that it is actually really important that we get from analysis and review to recommendations and action, right? And what does that look like? And Lisa highlighting, repeatedly that data is a tool that we can use to really be more proactive than waiting for, bad situations. So thank you all for all of that. And now I want to recognize Bethany to speak, who I will hopefully, okay. Are you able to unmute yourself?
Yes, I just did.
Perfect.
So I'm going to try to be really quick, but I had a lot of questions listening to everything and a lot of thoughts as well as about some of the comments that were made. But specifically what I wanted to talk about was, I guess, where I believe OPR, where they talked about how something will initially be reported as a larceny and then they get to the scene and it's a robbery. And I wanted to say, like, saying that something is a robbery still isn't giving much information, because robberies can happen without any weapon, without there being any danger to anyone. So somebody can just take something from you, literally just take something out of your hand. And in Washington, D.C., that's considered a robbery. Someone can push you and then take something, and that's considered a robbery. So saying that something is initially reported as a larceny and then you get on scene and it's a robbery doesn't really give much information in terms of whether the stakes were high or there was an immediate threat. But in listening to at least the information I got, I haven't, of course, reviewed anything, but my understanding is that there was no mention of a gun. And I believe OPR said that just because there was no mention of a gun doesn't mean there wasn't one, which also that to me doesn't make sense. In literally every 911 call I've ever heard, that typically the dispatcher says, was there a weapon involved? And so if that information isn't given, that seems like more of a systemic issue that the department probably needs to work out on fixing, because that's important. But yeah, like just this idea between like larceny versus robbery, that was something that I really wanted to comment on, because that it still doesn't give any information as to whether or not there was an immediate threat, if it was high stakes or dangerous. It just doesn't give any information.
Thank you for that input. I do think that a lot of what, Mummy's comments about, what's legal versus what's right and what's legislation versus policy. And, Charles, pointing our attention to our opportunities to turn systemic change in the direction of fairness and justice. I'm paraphrasing and adding words. So, but I think that the point that you're pointing to here is that, that threshold was too low for the response absent a specific, specifically identifiable or identified threat as, identified by the officer. I do really want to, as we're practicing, because we are working our sea legs here, we have to be kind of careful in our considerations as the COB of making sure that our individual recommendations and findings are based on this case and scenario and not, broader. In our annual reports, we will look at trends and review, those things in aggregate, but in these conversations, we're meant to be focused, very specifically on the facts and situation related to this case. So I also want to be equally mindful of jurisdictional differences where I don't have the kind of local. We had a lot of policy language on hand tonight, thanks mainly to Dave and then Ian and Memi mobilizing it, but I don't have that for larceny and robbery. But I don't think that changes the context of your comment. I do just want to keep us as we're kind of learning so that we can all advance the COB's opportunity to have an impact without, creating those things. So Bethany, thank you. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. Thank you for listening so carefully. Thank you for adding, context from your own experience. I understand that to be, very relevant and an important consideration. So yeah, we are grateful for all of y'all's time and input. Jim, was that a wave and a high five or a metaphorical handshake?
No, I'm sorry. That was just an acknowledgement of family.
Oh, good. Oh, well, please. Yeah, that's ideal.
Good.
I wish I had family in the house. Okay, excellent. So I want to check in on the COB members. If there's anything else folks want to add or reflect on the public comment before we move on to other agenda items. No. And then I want to check on Mummy to see if she's available to do the IPA report out. If not, I will. Oh, wonderful.
I will keep it very quick. I just want to give an update on our vacancies. So we still currently have vacancy for voting and non-voting positions. We have received applications for the voting positions, and Ian, Julie, and I did a couple interviews, and we are hoping to wrap that up this month and then make a recommendation for the county board to then appoint a COB member at, I'm thinking maybe one of their April meetings. So hopefully that should be taken care of very soon. We still are looking for more applications for the non-voting application. Again, that would be the person with prior law enforcement experience. So I just want to encourage you all to continue to circulate that application. It's available on our website. And to any of our participants in the chat who have law enforcement experience, not in Arlington County, but law enforcement experience, we would love to have you. That was the main thing that I wanted to highlight. I will be wrapping up my reports for Q1 of this year on anything that was exonerated by DEMS or deemed non-investigated. Basically, any of the complaints that were not put in the full administrative investigation process. So look out for that sometime towards the end of April. We will also be releasing our quarterly newsletter at the end of April for Q1. And I also wanted to, there's something else I was going to say. Julie and I are trying to plan out the investigations that we are going to do for the next couple of meetings in advance, so people know kind of what is being queued up, and you can go ahead and start looking at whatever evidence is associated with the investigation, particularly if you are the investigation leads. So please look out for an email that kind of calendars that out. We're looking to calendar out April, May, possibly even June, just to try to get through some of the backlogs. So Julie and I met and went through all of the outstanding ones from 2023 that we have not brought before the COB yet, and decided which ones we're going to do the full administrative hearing for, and then, or sorry, the full COB hearing for. And there were a couple of them that after concluding the investigation, did not really like result in any sort of significant like findings or investigation that I will just include in my quarterly report, as I've done with a couple of select cases before. We're just trying to prioritize the ones that we think would elicit, you know, meaningful or impactful like conversations and recommendations and that sort of thing, and doing so in a balanced way. So look out for an email on that, and then we'll be making some just fine tuning to our protocols around investigations review, and I will kick that over to Julie to talk about it whatever appropriate time. So defer to her there. And we'll also follow up on that with some emails. So just the point of this was, you know, make sure you're checking your emails over the next few days. There are 2 investigations that we're queuing up for next week's meeting. And so just please be on the lookout to make sure that you are fully informed about what documents you'll need to review. And those emails will also contain my reports as usual for the respective investigations. I think those are the main things. Does anybody have any specific questions or anything else that they would like me to touch on?
I just want to say, just in case we get kicked out at 9, which I don't think we will, but yes, our next meeting is next week. Okay, Ian's saying no, but our next meeting is next week. We will be meeting. We will have another investigation review. We apologize and we appreciate everyone's accommodating our logistical changes. And then back to you, Mummy, and then I'll go to open discussion. Any questions for Mummy? No?
And again, I just want to echo what has already been said tonight, specifically from the members of the community, commending you all on the job you're doing. This is all, you know, volunteer work for those of you who are listening from the public. You all dedicate a lot of time and effort and energy to serving on the board. And we truly appreciate it. Actually, while we were in this meeting, and got an email from a member of the community thanking you all for your service. So I just want to amplify that and express appreciation for your time.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. I'm going to kick off open discussion with just a couple of logistical reminders for folks who may not have been on the front end. Our next meeting is next week. We are going to have 2 March meetings to make up for the February meeting that we had to delay. Those will all be in person. March 20th is our next meeting, Wednesday at the county board or at the county building. And part of that is that we were given specific direction from the county board that until we clear out this backlog, we should not be prioritizing other activities like community outreach, which we have gotten direct input from the community that they want more of. So we're doing what we can to, you know, we had to stand up the processes, we had to do the training. I think that is an excuse that we really wanted to work past and get beyond, but then we ended up with this backlog and we were given pretty unambiguous direction that our resources need to be focused on clearing out the backlog. And in doing so, there is, you know, value to that, and that, you know, we're able to have more focused and specific and actionable conversations. I think that's really valuable. But I think we're all eager to get into a logistical routine where this feels more mature, better established. We really, really welcome, and I'm delighted to see kind of an expansion of public participation in these meetings. And we will look to return that energy of you guys participating in our meetings by coming to find you in yours and building opportunities to have one-on-one conversations. And I think the silver lining of, you know, what was a frustrating logistical directive is that we will have a lot now. We will have a core caseload of, you know, public investigation reviews completed where, you know, we can have probably a little bit more substantive dialogue with the communities beyond what is our structure, what is our role. So I see a comment in the chat about the community probably not being worried about the backlog over community engagement. I completely understand and empathize that. So hopefully we can just get up to speed in our next couple of meetings, and then we won't really be in this cycle anymore. So I want to open it to the COB members for open discussion. If there are other issues you all want to discuss, again, we'll do vice chair elections next week. I will send you in advance the list of evidence that you're meant to review for the next case. We will probably do that in the next couple of days so that you've got plenty of time, and we'll send a reminder. Anything else folks want to raise or discuss?
Hey, Julie, this is Gary. Just something that, you know, people are starting to look at the summer here already. And so I would just ask us maybe kind of have the framework of our meeting structure and give everybody a chance to kind of look out at least through, I would say through August, if we can kind of have our, you know, kind of a tentative plan, any adjustments, you know, in relation to the case backload and things of that sort, to make sure that the volunteers remain volunteers. So we can have a little balance on that. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. Yeah. Any closing comments? We did get to all of our agenda items. I think it's possible I was supposed to call for a vote for the break because we didn't do it at the same time. So I'll just say mea culpa on that, but it felt like the natural transition point. So I will get the hang of this. And again, we appreciate all y'all's patience and involvement. Mummy, Ian, anything you guys want to add to open discussion before we wrap up? Wonderful. Then, hearing none, I declare the meeting adjourned. Thank you everyone so much. We will look forward to seeing you next week. And please feel free to reach out to any of us directly in the interim.
Great.
Good
Thanks a lot.
Bye.
Thanks a lot, everybody.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Good night, y'all.
Good night, Fatima.
Good night. Good night, everybody. Bye-bye.